A black cleaning woman walks into a corporate tower just to do her job, mop in hand, head held high, but what happens next turns the entire building upside down. Executives laugh at her, mock her, even sabotage her work. But then, just 6 days later, she walks into the boardroom and fires the CEO in front of everyone. What she reveals leaves the entire company stunned and changes the rules forever. Stay with me. This is a story you'll never forget. Before we dive in, drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if this story moves you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember that quiet power can be the loudest of all. It all started on what looked like just an ordinary Monday. She walked into that glass kingdom like a storm disguised in silence. Her name was Loretta Fields. She wore the city's dust beneath her soles and the history of women like her in the curl of her spine. A mop in one hand, a battered bucket in the other, and a badge clipped to her chest that reduced her name to 5 printed letters and a barcode. Hamilton and Crane Global Holdings, where the air was filtered, the voices measured, and where men in blue-gray suits measured their worth by how little they acknowledged the hands that kept their floors from turning gray. They didn't see her, not really. Not as she was. They saw the uniform. They saw skin the color of damp cedar and presumed poverty. They saw a woman past middle age and assumed defeat. But that day, they mistook dust for ashes, and ashes, as Baldwin once warned, can give birth to fire. Loretta moved across the lobby floor like she had mopped cathedrals in her sleep. Each sweep of her mop carried the weight of a lineage ignored. Her mother, the great Alberta Fields, had wiped the blood off hospital floors during segregation and still sent 3 daughters to college. Her grandmother, Agnes Fields, was born into a cotton-picking life and died with no gravestone, but in her words was gospel. Loretta carried all of that into every polished tile, and nobody, not a single man or woman behind glass doors, could see it. That was her secret weapon, invisibility. And this morning, she wielded it like scripture. No one noticed when she paused beneath the chandelier, her dark eyes lifting to the glass reflections of men who thought themselves gods. The walls were covered in corporate milestones, plaques with names like Chet, Nathan, and Oliver, and photos of white smiles shaking white hands. Not a single brown woman among them, not one thread of history that looked like hers. That didn't bother Loretta. She wasn't here to be remembered in photos. She was here to rewrite the names on the frames. She made her way toward the janitor's closet, nodding briefly at a young assistant who passed her like wind. A glance, a flicker, then gone. That was the rhythm here. Workers were ghosts, meant to pass unseen, unheard. But Loretta's eyes never stopped moving. They studied. They remembered. They measured time in meetings overheard and hallway whispers. Her life had been a series of quiet observations, and now, finally, she stood at the edge of revelation. She opened the closet door, reached for a bottle of glass cleaner, and smiled. A small, crooked smile that had nothing to do with glass or cleanliness. This was the morning the slow revenge of the silent began. For what no one in that building knew, not the front desk receptionist who chuckled with derision, not the executive assistant who barely met her gaze, and certainly not the CEO Nathaniel Crane, was that Loretta Fields, under her uniform, under her quiet, owned the majority stake in their empire. She'd begun acquiring the shares 8 years ago, slowly, methodically, using a patchwork of shell companies, old favors, and connections earned, not bought. While Nathaniel Crane raised capital on panels and television interviews, she studied board bylaws. While the CEO Oliver Finch slashed labor benefits, she bought out the silent partners whose names never made the company Christmas cards. While the CFO justified layoffs with spreadsheets, she secured controlling interest through the chaos of a merger they'd all celebrated with champagne. And now, she mopped the marble floors not because she had to, but because she needed to see how the machinery worked when the lights were off. She needed to understand the people who were never photographed. Because one cannot lead what one does not truly see. As she rolled her cart toward the elevator, two young interns spoke in hushed voices near the break room. One of them, a black girl no older than 21, clutched her notebook like a shield. "Did you see the new cleaning lady?" whispered the white intern beside her, smirking. "She probably won't last a week. They come and go, you know." The black intern's eyes met Loretta's. There was something there. Recognition. Not of identity, but of kinship. Loretta smiled gently. The girl whispered, almost like prayer, "Don't let them get to you." Loretta nodded. They never could. And with that, she entered the elevator, the one that only executives took, and pressed the button for the top floor. No one stopped her. They never did. Ghosts don't set off alarms. When the doors opened, she walked into the polished heart of Hamilton and Crane. The boardroom loomed in front of her, glass walls, mahogany table, chairs arranged like thrones. Inside, the men laughed. You know the kind. Old laughter. Inherited laughter. Laughter passed from plantation porches to skyscraper suites. Nathaniel, silver-haired, tapped his fingers on the table like he was conducting a symphony of arrogance. Richard, the marketing director, leaned back, smooth-talking some tale about expansion into Brazil. Oliver said something about cutting waste, and they all knew waste meant workers. James, the CFO, lifted his glass. "Smart work," he said, "not hard work." "That's how we got here." Richard chuckled. "Yeah, not like the janitor downstairs." "Imagine her watching us, thinking this is as close as she'll ever get." Oliver grinned. "Some people are just born to clean up after greatness." They laughed. They laughed like the devil was on payroll. Outside the boardroom, Loretta cleaned the glass. Her rag moved in slow, measured circles. Her hand was steady, her eyes unblinking. She watched them the way a hawk watches prey, not for anger, not for vengeance, but for understanding. They thought they ran the world because they never saw the ones holding it together. She finished the window and walked on, her steps slow, certain. She had seen what she came to see. Tomorrow, the boardroom would not laugh. Tomorrow, the boardroom would listen. They say time reveals all things, but in this country, time mostly reveals what folks are still too proud or too frightened to admit. Loretta Fields returned to that glimmering tower the next morning, the same way she had walked through decades of America's unspoken rules, with grace that did not ask for permission. The same plain blue uniform clung to her frame like armor. The same ID badge swayed against her hip, as if it too had a heartbeat. But something had shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Not in her, she had always known, but in the world around her. Because the thing about the invisible is, once it starts to see, it cannot unsee. And Loretta, God help them all, had started to see everything. In the lobby, a middle-aged white man, one of the mid-level managers whose name no one remembered and whose ego stretched like cheap cologne, dropped his coffee near the elevators. The paper cup rolled toward her feet, and he barely looked at her as he muttered, "Be a doll, will you?" Loretta didn't flinch. She picked up the cup, yes, not out of servitude, but strategy, because some revolutions begin not by raising fists, but by remembering exactly who saw you kneel. "You're welcome," she said, soft and clipped, her voice carrying a weight that didn't need to shout. He blinked, confused, then scowled, then walked away like the moment hadn't just marked him. That was the first moment of the day, small, bitter, but telling. And there would be more. Upstairs, on the 35th floor, the silent orchestra of hierarchy played on. Executives whispered across glass desks. Assistants smiled with eyes that didn't quite smile. And through it all moved Loretta, the anomaly. Some had begun to notice her. Not because they recognized her power, not yet, but because something about her didn't fit. She cleaned as she had the day before, but her ears were sharper now, her intuition ablade. In the break room, a woman, early 40s, light-skinned, high-heeled, with the kind of tight curls that took 4 hours and a hot comb, leaned into a conversation with another executive assistant. "I swear," They're hiring anybody now, she said, eyeing Loretta's mop. No background checks, I bet. You just walk in, say you're reformed, and suddenly you've got access to the building. The other woman laughed. Well, you know how they are. It's all diversity quotas these days. Doesn't matter if they're qualified, as long as they check a box. Loretta kept her head down. But her shoulders remembered every insult like names in a prayer book. She didn't confront them. No. She filed it away. Because there is a war in America that has never stopped being fought, the war over dignity. And dignity, for the Black woman, has always been the first thing taken and the last thing restored. By midday, the whispers had multiplied. In the conference room, she overheard Oliver, the operations manager with an Ivy League tie and a plantation smile, grumbling about janitors getting too comfortable. She looked me in the eye, he told Richard. I mean, that's new. Usually, they know their place. They're union now, Richard said with a shrug. You know how bold that makes them. I don't care if she's a union queen. This is a Fortune 500 company. We don't need Rosa Parks scrubbing our floors. Loretta paused just outside the door. The words landed on her like ash on fresh linen. Soft, but staining. And this was the second trial. Not a cross burning in the night, no. Racism had evolved into something quieter, something smooth and corporate, something that wore a tie and smiled at Black faces in the HR pamphlet but never invited them to the strategy meeting. At lunch, she sat alone in the supply hallway and watched through the window as 3 young white interns clinked salad forks and laughed over stock tips. A Black delivery man came through with a package, sweating from the heat. They didn't look at him. Not once. And Loretta realized it wasn't hatred anymore that kept people separate. It was a habit. Generational, subconscious, American habit, the kind you don't question because your parents didn't, and their parents before them called it just how things are. That night, she returned home not to a penthouse, but to her modest apartment where the walls held books instead of mirrors. She sat beneath a photograph of her mother, Alberta Fields, eyes like granite, a Bible in one hand and a mop in the other, and thought about what this nation had taught them both. It had taught them that silence was survival. That smiling when you were bleeding was professionalism. That carrying other people's weight without complaint made you strong, as if strength was something you were born into rather than forced to wear like a yoke. But Loretta was tired of wearing things. She wanted to own them now. And so, she wrote. Late into the night, she took notes. She drafted personnel changes. She highlighted departments that needed structural reform. She didn't just plan revenge. That would be too small. She planned reformation. A resurrection. Because you see, dear reader, especially you who remember segregation signs and redlined blocks and the rusted chains of quiet American exclusion, the most dangerous thing in the world is not a Black woman with anger. It is a Black woman with a plan. Tomorrow, the tests will continue. Tomorrow, the whispers would grow louder. But Loretta Fields was no longer beneath their notice. She was already above their reach. On the third day, the building began to push back. It started with small things, as it always does when power begins to shift and the privileged consents, in ways they don't understand, that the ground beneath them is no longer theirs. The printer on the 30th floor jammed 4 times. Somehow it was Loretta's fault. The espresso machine sputtered in the executive lounge. They asked her, not maintenance. And someone, no doubt thinking they were clever, scribbled, "Clean me, Harriet," on the inside of a restroom stall. Loretta wiped it away without a word. She didn't flinch. She didn't even scowl. But her silence was no longer submission. It was something else. Something more dangerous. It was a memory. And memory, in this country, is a weapon if you're born Black. See, for folks over 65, you've lived long enough to know what coded language sounds like. You remember when it was shouted. You remember when it wore a badge or burned a cross. And now, in your autumn years, you see it return dressed in corporate policy and polite distance. What Loretta was enduring wasn't hatred in its old form, it was erasure, precision-trained and hidden behind HR handbooks and performance reviews. And it was this newer version of racism, sanitized, deniable, that would test her most. By mid-morning, the tension had grown teeth. As she walked the corridor to refresh the supply carts, two women in accounting, both white, lowered their voices as she passed. "I don't care who she is," one whispered. "It's weird. She acts like she belongs here. She thinks she's better than the rest," the other muttered. "Like she's watching us, judging. She probably has a record. You know how they are." Loretta paused at the water cooler, back still turned. The weight of those words pressed against her like the scent of rain just before a storm breaks. She breathed in slowly. She had heard it all before, in diners that refused her mother service, in school board meetings where the loudest voices spoke only in dog whistles. America had taught her early, what they fear most isn't your anger. It's your presence. At lunch, she sat again in the hallway, not because she didn't belong in the cafeteria, but because she did. And that unsettled people more than her mop ever could. One man, a senior project consultant with a beard that tried to age him into respectability, approached her. "You know," he began, resting his hand on a stack of sanitized paper towels, "I've been meaning to ask, you're awfully articulate. Have you ever considered moving up?" Loretta looked up, her gaze calm, unwavering. "Up from what?" He blinked. "You know. From cleaning. Maybe admin typing. That sort of thing." "Ah," she said, her voice like a knife wrapped in velvet. "From floors to keyboards. That's what progress looks like to you." He chuckled, unsure. "Well, just trying to help." "No, sir," she said with quiet gravity. "You're trying to measure me against a rulebook I didn't write. And I'm not playing your game." He walked away, flustered. But not angry, not yet. That would come later, once her truth started knocking on their doors. By 3 o'clock, the building seemed to hum with unease. The CEO, Nathaniel Crane, held a closed-door meeting with his lieutenants. There had been a shift, he said. Morale issues. Trust concerns. Richard, ever the PR puppet, suggested sending a memo to remind the cleaning staff of professional boundaries. James, the CFO, wanted cameras added to the break rooms. But Nathaniel had seen something in her eyes that the others had missed. Something old. Something Southern. Something that reminded him of a story his grandfather once told about a housemaid who stayed quiet for years until the land his family sat on, land once taken with blood and paper, legally returned to her people through a loophole he called a damn disgrace. "I want her out," Nathaniel said, tapping his pen hard against the table. "I don't care how. They wouldn't fire her, not yet. That would look bad, optics as they say. No, they'd pressure her, isolate her, make her feel so unwelcome that she'd vanish, and they'd keep their kingdom just as it was, clean on the surface, wrought beneath the marble." But Loretta didn't flinch. That night, she went home and opened her safe. Inside were documents, real estate holdings, shell company registrations, minutes from secret board meetings, and most of all, shares. Controlling shares. Her inheritance wasn't in bloodlines, it was in vision. She had spent years weaving herself into the very spine of the empire they thought was theirs. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the window with a cup of sweet tea, her mother's photo on the windowsill, and whispered, "Tomorrow, Mama. Tomorrow they'll know my name." You see, this chapter isn't about the fall. Not yet. It's about the tremor before the quake. It's about the moment when a woman, overlooked, underestimated, uninvited, chooses not to knock, but to build her own damn door. And tomorrow, Loretta Fields will walk through it. The fourth day began not with a shout but with a shift. Like the way old houses creak before they fall, or how the Mississippi stirs before the flood. Hamilton and Crane didn't yet know it, but the storm had already started. Loretta Fields walked into the building like always, head high, step soft, the mop bucket trailing like a shadow that didn't belong to the body, but to a history far larger than the marble underfoot. And on that morning, it was not the uniform that spoke, but the silence around it. People didn't look at her the same. No longer invisible, no, not quite seen either, but regarded. Regards the way you regard something unfamiliar on your porch in the dark, with fear pretending to be curious. In the elevator, a junior manager stepped in and stood pressed to the opposite wall, clutching his laptop like a Bible in a hurricane. He didn't speak. Just breathed nervously, as if proximity to Loretta might require an apology his ancestors had not taught him how to give. She looked straight ahead. The floor numbers blinked slowly, 28, 29, 30, like the beat of an old Southern drum. When she stepped out, she heard him exhale. And she thought of every time her grandmother had been told to use the service entrance, every time her mother had been mistaken for someone else's help, and every time she herself had been asked if she was lost. But she wasn't lost. She had never been found. That day, the pressure began to mount in earnest. Her mop bucket was replaced, quietly, with one that had a broken wheel. Her access badge glitched at the executive elevators, forcing her to wait downstairs for clearance. When she asked IT for help, the technician muttered something about strange priorities and walked off. And still, she remained composed. Not because it didn't cut, but because she had long ago learned the rhythm of white discomfort. It starts with subtle distance, turns into sabotage, and ends, if left unchecked, with violence masked as policy. At 2 p.m., the boardroom held a security briefing. Not about cyber threats or legal risk, but about her. Not by name, of course. Not yet. But the language had shifted. Potential insider anomaly. Unusual behavioral reports. Non-standard employee engagement. Nathaniel Crane sat at the head of the table like a man guarding a throne. The men beside him nodded with the practiced worry of those who never had to understand the soul of a problem, only the shape of its threat. She's been spotted in sensitive areas, Oliver grumbled. It's inappropriate. Hell, she smiled at me the other day like she knew something, James muttered. She does know something, Richard added. That's the damn problem. They didn't know what she knew, and that terrified them more than anything she could have said aloud. Because when a black woman is silent and still smiling, they know there's a reckoning coming. Down the hall, Loretta was mopping by the reception desks when a young black intern approached her. He moved like someone who had learned, too young, how to walk small in white spaces. His badge hung from his belt. His shoulders slumped slightly. They're talking about you, he said, low. They're saying you're stirring things up. Loretta smiled faintly, still pushing the mop. Let them, she said. He hesitated. Aren't you worried? She stopped and looked at him for the first time. Really looked. Son, she said, I was born worried. But I won't die silent. He nodded, something in him lifting. That was the power of presence, not fame, not title, but the audacity of dignity standing where it had been denied. By late afternoon, the tests escalated. HR called her in for a chat, no reason given. A white woman in a gray blazer read from a clipboard with the clinical tone of someone trained to bury bias in bureaucracy. We've received concerns that you've been engaging in conversations outside the scope of your responsibilities. I've been responding when spoken to, Loretta replied. Still, it creates discomfort, the woman said. Discomfort, Loretta repeated, rolling the word in her mouth like bitter tea. And what does my presence make them remember, I wonder? The woman didn't answer. You don't want me to be quiet, Loretta continued. You want me to be grateful. But I know what I'm worth, and that makes y'all uncomfortable. The woman blinked. You're free to return to work, she said stiffly. I never stopped working, Loretta replied. She walked out of that office taller than when she'd entered. Not because she won anything, not yet, but because she had not yielded. And for a black woman in America, not yielding is the closest thing to revolution you get on a weekday. That evening, as the sun cast gold across the glass lobby, she stood once more in front of the massive portraits lining the walls. All white men, all smug, all fossilized. She looked up at them and said, under her breath, "Tomorrow, I'm going to fire your legacy." Because this was never about revenge. This was about remembrance, about calling out the lie beneath the marble. And Loretta Fields, with her mop and her memory, was coming to remind them. On the fifth day, the mask began to slip. Hamilton and Crane, for all its polished glass and policy statements, began to tremble beneath the weight of a truth it had long tried to forget, that the world it built was never built for everyone. And certainly not for someone like Loretta Fields to walk its corridors with a plan that didn't include asking for permission. By now, word had begun to spread. Not formally, no email, no memo, no acknowledgement from the board. But in glances, in whispers, in the hushed corners of elevators and break rooms. The cleaning lady, they said, she's up to something. She's not like the others. She's watching. She's waiting. Waiting for what? That was the question, wasn't it? The kind of question that makes men in boardrooms lock their doors. That morning, Loretta's badge was deactivated entirely. No elevator access. No digital trail. Not even a record in the visitor's log. She was, in the eyes of the system, erased. Not punished directly, no, that would leave a trace, but forgotten into silence. But Loretta didn't rage. She didn't knock. She walked up the 29 flights of stairs, one step at a time, her breath steady, her silence louder than any announcement they might have dared to make. You see, you don't need to shout when the building itself is already listening. On the 30th floor, security met her. "Ma'am, we've had a system glitch," the guard said, eyes avoiding hers. "We'll need you to return to the lower floors for reassignment." "Is that so?" Loretta asked, her voice calm as Mississippi summer heat. He nodded. "We're just following protocol." "And whose protocol," she asked, "decides which floors a black woman can stand on in 2025? The guard flinched. Not because he understood the history, no, but because somewhere in his blood, something was remembered. She didn't fight. She turned. But not before she looked past him, through the glass, into the boardroom, where Nathaniel Crane sat stiffly, watching. Their eyes locked. For the first time, he didn't look powerful. He looked like a man waiting for a knock that might break the door clean off the hinges. Downstairs, the staff had started noticing too. The janitors, the delivery men, the cafeteria women, people whose names were never called in meetings, felt the shift. Loretta moved among them not as a prophet, but as one of their own. She spoke softly, asked questions, and listened. The stories spilled out like floodwater. "He cut our overtime with no notice. They fired Denise when she asked for medical leave. They said my accent made clients uncomfortable. She collected their truths like scripture. Not because she needed proof, she had enough of that locked in her safe, but because justice without testimony is theater. And she wasn't here for the show. She was here to end the performance." That afternoon, an emergency HR review was scheduled. Loretta was summoned again. This time, 3 men in suits sat behind the desk, not just one. They had the air of men about to deliver a verdict, but not in a court of law. No, this was the court of image, where the defendant is always the one without a title. "Miss Fields," one of them began, "there's concern about your conduct." "Speak plain," she said. "You're worried a black woman with a mop might be thinking." The man coughed. "There's also concern about the amount of time you spend interacting with staff." "You mean talking to the people who make your building work?" "There's a chain of command," another added. "Procedures. And where's that chain when they dock our checks?" "When will they fire the cafeteria crew before Christmas?" she asked. "You want order, but only if it keeps you comfortable." They didn't respond. Because they couldn't. Because men who've built their power on silence have no language for resistance they can't control. By the end of the meeting, she wasn't fired. Not officially. But her hours were cut. Her floor access was revoked. Her locker emptied. They thought they'd backed her into a corner. But they forgot. This country's most powerful stories have been written from the corners. That evening, she stood in the parking garage, staring up at the Hamilton and Crane sign, white, shining, unbothered. And she smiled. Because tomorrow was the day. The day she would walk into the boardroom with papers in hand, names on contracts, and the quiet fire of generations behind her. The day when the mop would no longer be the symbol of labor, but the symbol of witness to everything they tried to bury. The truth, she knew, doesn't come with fanfare. It comes slowly, relentless, like water beneath a locked door. And Loretta Fields was the flood. By the sixth day, Hamilton and Crane no longer smelled like confidence. It smelled like fear wearing cologne, sharp, artificial, and sweating through its seams. Loretta Fields arrived early. Too early for the security guards to pretend they didn't see her. Too early for the secretaries to hide behind smiles that didn't reach their eyes. She walked in not as a ghost in blue, but as a storm with good posture. And though her uniform hadn't changed, everything else had. They could feel it in the silence that followed her down the corridor like a new kind of thunder. The building had tried to erase her. And it had failed. So now it tried the next tool in the American drawer, humiliation. Someone had gone into her locker, scratched "Know Your Place" into the metal with a key, left a used tissue inside. A symbolic gesture, almost quaint in its cruelty. But racism has always been theatrical like that, always needing a stage, an audience, and a performer willing to be broken in half just to make someone else feel whole. Loretta stared at the words for a long while. Not because they surprised her, they didn't, but because they confirmed something deeper. The closer a black woman gets to power, the more violent the attempts become to shove her back down the stairs she built with her own two hands. She didn't clean it. She didn't wipe it down. She left the locker open, wide, and visible to every janitor and intern and coffee runner who walked past that hallway. Let them see it. Let them feel the weight of what black dignity costs in a white structure. That morning, an email leaked. Not an official company memo, no, just a little whisper sent from one executive to another, the kind of thing passed between old friends behind closed mahogany doors. Whoever this woman is, she's dangerous. There are rumors she's involved with union organizing. Possibly some activist investment group. Get legal to look into her. We can't afford a situation. A situation. That's what they called her. Not a woman. Not a leader. A situation. And therein lies the truth for every older American who remembers what real situations look like. You remember dogs in Birmingham. You remember Little Rock, lunch counters, freedom rides. The country told you, then, that it wasn't racism, it was order. It wasn't hatred, it was law. It wasn't a woman asking for power, it was a situation. Loretta was the echo of that memory walking among them. At noon, she walked past the boardroom again. The glass was cleaner than usual. She'd done it herself, not out of duty, but precision. If they were going to watch her, she'd make sure the view was flawless. Inside, the top brass were gathered. Nathaniel Crane looked thinner than usual. His tie tighter. His eyes scanned the room like a man trying to find the fire before the smoke revealed its source. Oliver, the operations man, muttered, "She's destabilizing morale." Richard, the spin doctor in a suit, said, "We've got shareholders asking questions." And James, cold and calculating, snapped, "Then let's remind them who's in charge." But Nathaniel didn't answer. Because deep down, he wasn't sure anymore. That afternoon, something shifted again, only this time, it came from below. In the cafeteria, a cashier named Nia stood up when Loretta came through. Loud enough for the whole room to hear, she said, "Miss Fields, we saved you a seat." The room froze. Not because of the words, but because of who said them. Black and brown and working-class faces suddenly looked up, not away. For once, the room didn't scatter. It stood still. Loretta sat. She didn't smile, not quite. But there was a glint in her eye like the light catching a blade beneath a preacher's robe. They had tried to isolate her. But isolation requires silence. And silence, at last, had cracked. By 4 o'clock, the building had split into two. Not by color, though color, Lord knows, was still its scaffolding, but by awareness. There were those who knew something was changing, and those who feared it might. And at the center of it all stood a woman with nothing more than her history, her mind, and her dignity. That was all she needed. Back in her apartment that night, she lit a candle. Not out of ritual, but remembrance. On the table before her were two things: a folder of documents that proved she was the majority shareholder of Hamilton and Crane Industries, and a photograph of her mother, Alberta Fields, standing in front of a white woman's kitchen in 1964, wearing the same kind of uniform. Loretta whispered to the photo, "You cleaned their plates, Mama. I'm about to take their table." And with that, she closed the folder. Tomorrow, she would walk into that boardroom not to demand a seat, but to pull the entire floor out from under them. On the 7th day, the building held its breath. Even the walls, those sterile white monuments to hierarchy, seemed to brace themselves. The air was different, heavier somehow, like the air before a funeral, or a revolution, or both. Because what Hamilton and Crane did not yet understand was that death and rebirth can share the same hour, and sometimes that hour arrives dressed in blue and carrying a folder full of receipts. Loretta Fields came early again, but this time not to sweep, not to polish, not to collect the crumbs of another man's empire. She wore her uniform, yes, the same one they'd come to associate with servitude, but on her shoulders it hung differently now. Like a shroud, like a flag. She walked through the lobby like a name they had tried to erase from the books, but kept finding carved into the stone. The security guard tried to stop her. "Miss Fields, I don't think you're cleared for..." She handed him a letter, crisp, formal, and signed. Effective today, it read, "Loretta Fields is granted unrestricted access to all corporate floors and proceedings. As majority shareholder and controlling interest of Hamilton and Crane Holdings." The guard read it once, then again, then looked up with a face full of disbelief, confusion, and something that looked dangerously close to shame. "Have a good morning," she said. And she meant it. But not for them. On the 35th floor, the boardroom was already buzzing. Nathaniel Crane was pacing, muttering about optics and fallout and contingencies. James, always calm, suggested legal might still find a loophole. Richard, the PR man, wanted to spin it, call her a partner in equity, and hope the press would lap it up. And then she walked in. No knock. No hesitation. No apology. They didn't look up at first. Still convinced this was some last act of protest. Still thinking she might pull a mop from behind her back and wipe the windows before leaving for good. But she didn't stop at the door. She walked straight to the head of the table. And stood. Nathaniel looked up first, confused. Then be wary. Then something worse, afraid. "Miss Fields," he said, standing as if to reassert dominance, "this is a closed session." "No," she said, and laid the documents down like thunder on the table. "This is an open reckoning." Silence fell like dust in a graveyard. "I am the controlling shareholder of this company," she said, voice steady, deep, and clear enough to cut marble. "I hold 52.3% of your futures, and I didn't earn it by smiling or by shrinking or by waiting for the world to change on its own. I earned it by studying you. Every policy. Every layoff, every petty humiliation you wrote into the fabric of this building." Richard tried to laugh. "This has to be some kind of mistake." She turned to him, slowly, deliberately. "Like the time you docked the cafeteria staff's wages and called it budget alignment? Or the time you reduced maternity leave because the optics weren't great? Was that a mistake too, Richard?" He sat down. James leaned forward. "What do you want?" And there it was. The question they always ask once they realize they can no longer ignore you. Not who you are, not how this happens, but what you want. as if black ambition must always justify itself to the people it surpasses. "I want justice," she said. "But not in the way you understand it." She pulled out a second document, this one a list of demands: living wages for all staff, reinstatement of fired workers, whistleblower protections, diversity reform in the hiring process, and, most damning of all, a board reorganization. Starting with Nathaniel Crane. "You're firing me," he said flatly. "No," Loretta said. "You fired yourself when you built a company that could only survive by pretending people like me didn't exist." He stared at her. And for the first time, in the eyes of a man who had spent his life looking through her kind, she saw recognition. And behind that, defeat. "I was born on the underside of this country," she said quietly, now addressing them all. "I scrubbed its floors, watched it lie to my mother, cheat my grandmother, and smile while doing it. I know the language of respectability. I learned it so well I could speak it better than you. But the difference is, I don't need it to tell the truth." The room was still, but something in the air had shifted, like the moment the sky cracks and thunder makes everything clear. "You called me invisible," she said. "Now you'll have to call me boss." And with that, she sat. Not as a cleaner, not as a symbol, but as the rightful heir to a kingdom built on bones. And so the 8th day did not come with fire nor with applause. It came quietly, as all reckonings do, the kind that doesn't scream for headlines, but instead rewrites the fine print of power. The morning after the boardroom upheaval, the marble floors of Hamilton and Crane reflected something new, not just light, but the truth. Loretta Fields did not come in through the employee entrance. She came through the front, where once she had pushed her mop in silence. She passed the reception desk, now occupied by a young man who smiled without condescension. The same intern who once said nothing now stood straighter when she entered the elevator. The same hallway that once carried whispers now carried her name. It is a strange thing, to live long enough to see the ground shift. But strangers still knew you were the one who moved it, inch by inch, with hands the world never bothered to watch. In her new office, top floor, no glass ceiling, Loretta sat not behind a desk, but before a wall lined with photos. Not the old ones, white men shaking white hands in celebration of their own inevitability. Those were gone. Now hung portraits of the real architects of labor: janitors, cafeteria workers, administrative assistants, custodians, and one photo at the center of Alberta Fields in a cotton apron, holding a Bible in one hand and her daughter's hand in the other. You see, people talk about progress like it's a line that moves forward. But the truth is, it's a circle that loops back and demands we remember the very people we've tried to forget. That week, changes came not in slogans, but in systems. Pay equity audits, expanded healthcare for low-wage staff, hiring panels that looked like the country, not just a zip code. And perhaps most revolutionary of all, an open forum held each Friday, where the highest-paid executives sat and listened to the people who scrubbed their floors. And they had to listen, because the woman they once laughed at now signed their checks. But this isn't a fairy tale. This isn't the neat ending America likes to package when guilt becomes too inconvenient. No, this is still America. And the ghosts of comfort and supremacy do not leave quietly. Some employees quit, claimed they felt displaced under the new culture. One anonymous op-ed appeared online, From Mop to Monarchy: How Identity Politics Hijacked a Legacy Brand. And more than once, Loretta found her name mentioned not in celebration, but suspicion. As if justice, when served by black hands, must always be a performance instead of principle. But she didn't waver, because she had never asked to be liked. She had only asked to be seen. And the older folks, the ones who remembered the bus boycotts, the segregated classrooms, the whispered warnings from back alley barbershops and beauty parlors, they understood. They sent letters. Some handwritten, some typed on fading ribbon ink. "Miss Fields, I never thought I'd see someone like you do what you did. I'm proud. My mother would have been proud too. I remember when my father had to clean offices after his night shift. He used to say, "The day they know our names, we'll be free." I think he was talking about you. Don't let them wear you down. You walked through a fire they'll never admit existed. Because that's the truth of it, isn't it? Racism does not always come in shouting. Sometimes it comes in structure. In polite silence. In credentials and closed doors. It comes in rooms designed never to include you, and then asks why you're so angry when you break in. But Loretta did not break in. She owned it now. And what she owned most of all was her story. At the end of the day, she stood at the window, watching the sun slide down the buildings of a city that still didn't quite know how to love her. But I will learn. Behind her, someone knocked. It was the young black intern, the one who had once whispered in fear. "I just wanted to say," he began, "I see you. I really see you." Loretta smiled. "That," she said, "is how change begins." And though the fight would continue, because it always does, something irreversible had taken place. Not a revolution of fire, but of remembrance. Of dignity no longer whispered, but spoken out loud. In boardrooms. In break rooms. In the hearts of those who had been told all their lives to wait. And for the first time in that building's long, echoing history, the waiting had ended.